Hi guys, we are discussing the book The Rigvedic People by Mr. Bibi Lal, and in this video we start the second chapter on the Aryan invasion theory and in-depth analysis. The seeds of the concept that the Aryans were alien to India had in a way been sown as far as back in 19th century when a renowned German scholar, Max Müller, the infamous Max Müller, who has created so many problems, dated the Vedas to circa 1200 BCE. Since he had no concrete evidence to go by, he took recourse to ad hocism. Accepting that the Sutra literature was datable to circa 6th century BCE, Müller thought that at a period of 200 years would be good enough for each of the preceding textual periods of the Vedic literature, namely those of the Aranyakas, Brahmanas and the Vedas. Thus, 600 plus 200 plus 200 plus 200 is equal to 1200 BC. This was the magic figure he arrived at. It may have been a fragile ray of light at a time when there was almost complete darkness surrounding the date of the Vedas. The proverbial something is better than nothing, but this ad hocism did not go unnoticed. Müller's contemporaries like Goldstucker, Whitney and Wilson came down heavily upon him and questioned this kind of methodology. Cornered from all sides, Müller climbed down and wrote in his preface to the Rigveda as follows. He says, Max Müller says, I have repeatedly dwelt on the merely hypothetical character of the dates which I have ventured to assign to the first periods of Vedic literature. All I have claimed for them is that they are minimum dates, and that the literary productions of each period which either still exist or which formerly existed could hardly be accounted for within shorter limits of time than those suggested. But this kind of half-hearted apology did not work, and Max Müller was obliged to categorically admit in Physical Religion, his book in 1890, which was reprinted in 1979, that if now we ask how we can fix the dates of these periods, it is quite clear that we cannot fix a terminum aqua. Whether the Vedic hymns were composed in 1000 or 1500 or 2000 or 3000 BC, no power on earth will ever determine. The great pity, however, is that in spite of such a candid confession by Max Müller himself, his fatwa of 1200 BCE still holds good with some of his followers, both in India and abroad. A seed once sown keeps on throwing up its shoots, in spite of heavy doses of plant killers. Anyway, the eventual effect of Max Müller's dating of the Vedas to 1200 BCE showed up when in the 1920s the Indus civilization was discovered on the Indian subcontinent. Since some objects belonging to this civilization had also been found in cultural deposits in Western Asia in a datable context of the 3rd millennium BCE, it was but natural to assign the Indian civilization as well to that period. The fallout of it all was that since according to the fatwa of Max Müller the Vedas were only as old as 1200 BCE, the Indus Valley civilization was at once declared to be pre-Vedic and non-Vedic. Further, since the only other major ethnic group in India was that of the Dravidian speaking people, the Dravidian language so to speak, the language family, not in a racial sense, it was a downright conclusion that the authors of the Indus civilization were none other than the Dravidian speakers. To make this theory more spicy, it was further added that the Indo-Aryan invaders destroyed the Indus civilization and its Dravidian-speaking authors were driven away to the South India, where the Dravidian-speaking people live even today. To make this thesis look more plausible, it was argued that while the bulk of the Indus people migrated all the way to the South India, a handful of them managed to stay behind. And these survivors are identified with a small group of Brahui-speaking people living in a part of Balochistan in Pakistan. The Brahui issue has been examined by many scholars who hold that this language is not a part of the Dravidian group. On the other hand, they think that it is an offshoot of the Eastern Elamite. Some other scholars opine that the Brahui speakers are not ancient inhabitants of the area but moved thereto during the medieval times, which means after 1200-1300 AD. Thus, not much weight can be attached to the Brahui factor in holding that the Brahui speakers of Balochistan are remnants of the ancient people who authored the Indian civilization. We now turn our attention to the thesis that the Indus people, who supposedly were Dravidian speakers, were driven by the Indo-Aryan invaders to South India. If this thesis has even an iota of truth, we should find the cultural remains of the incoming Indus people in South India. But the fact of the matter is that there is not even a single site associable with the Indus civilization in the whole of South India, be it Tamil Nadu or Andhra Pradesh or Karnataka or Kerala. On the other hand, what we find is that around that time, the just stated regions of South India were occupied by the Neolithic folks. Are we then supposed to believe that Indus people, on reaching South India, suddenly shed off their advanced culture and took to a Stone Age way of living after coming to South India? All this clearly controverts any immigration of Indus people into South India. The thesis that the Indus people were Dravidian speakers can be test-checked in another manner. It has been observed all over the world that even when a new set of people come to a country, settle there and set up towns and cities of their own, the settlements of the earlier inhabitants continue to be there with their original names. To cite a well-known example, a few centuries ago there was a mass-scale migration of the Europeans, including British, to what is now known as the United States of America. These immigrants forcibly took over lands from the original inhabitants, then called Red Indians and now American Indians, also Amerindians. They were pushed into areas what are euphemistically called known as the Indian Reserves. Anyway, that is American history. The point that I wish to make here is that even though the newcomers established their own cities like New York, New Jersey and so on, gave names to rivers like the Hudson, the names given by the earlier people could not be obliterated. Examples of the continuity of older names are the cities of Chicago, Massachusetts, and rivers known as Missouri, Mississippi, and there are Cherokee streets all over USA. In some city or the other, you will find a Cherokee Avenue, because Cherokee is the Cherokee I think was a tribe, a Native American tribe, and also Cherokee is a skin drum they used to play. That was called a Cherokee drum. Nearer home, Delhi is a good example of such continuity. While the incoming British established Lutyens' New Delhi, the old Delhi known as Shah Jahanabad is still there. In fact, still earlier settlements like Kila Rai Pithora and even the earliest known as Indraprastha, bounded by what is called the Purana Killa, continue to bear the same name. And Bibi Lal was the person who I think dug up or did some significant research of Indraprastha, which established that Indraprastha was in fact in Delhi. The point that is being made by citing these examples is to repeat what has already been stated, that older names do not vanish in the air, though the new ones come into being on the terra firma. Let us project this analogy back into the Indus times. If the Indus Valley people, who are claimed to have been Dravidian speakers, were driven away by the invading Aryans to South India, there should nevertheless remain some Dravidian-oriented names of cities and rivers in the vast domain of the Indus Valley civilization. But the hard fact is that there is not even a single example to testify this. Why is this so? The reason is very clear. The Indus people were not Dravidian speakers. If they were not Dravidian speakers, then who were they? What was their ethnic identity? While we shall answer this question a little later, here we examine in some detail the hollowness of the Aryan invasion theory. Mortimer Wheeler, later knighted to Sir Mortimer Wheeler, in the report on his 1946 excavations at Harappa, wrote as follows. Mortimer Wheeler writes, Aryan invasion of the land of seven rivers, the Punjab and its environs, constantly assumes the form of an onslaught upon the walled cities of the Aborigines. For these cities, the term used in the Rigveda is Pur, meaning a rampart, fort or stronghold, like Singapura. Indra, the Aryan war god, is Puramadara, fort destroyer. He shatters 90 forts for his Aryan protege Divodasa. Where are or were these citadels? It has in the past been supposed that they were mythical or were quote-unquote merely places of refuge against attack, ramparts of hardened earth with palisades and a ditch. End quote. The recent excavation of Harappa may be thought to have changed the picture. Here we have a highly evolved civilization of essentially non-Aryan type, now known to have employed massive fortifications, and known also to have dominated the river system of northwestern India at a time not distant from the likely period of the earlier Aryan invasions of that region. What destroyed this firmly settled civilization? Climatic, economic, political deterioration may have weakened it, but its ultimate extinction is more likely to have been completed by deliberate and large-scale destruction. It may be no mere chance that at a late period of Mohenjo-daro, men, women and children appear to have been massacred there. On circumstantial evidence, Indra stands accused. The quote of Mortimer Wheeler ends here. Now Bibilal writes, his pronouncement, namely, quote-unquote, on circumstantial evidence Indra stands accused, may be regarded as the high watermark of the Aryan invasion theory, which became, as it were, the gospel truth for decades to come until it was demonstrated to be hollow by subsequent writers. Let us first have a look at the kingpin of Wheeler's thesis, namely the so-called massacre at Mohenjo-daro. Having an overall perimeter of about 4.5 kilometers, the site has two components, a small fortified area on the west called the citadel, and a much larger area on the east known as the lower town. While the former contained many religious and other important structures and may have been the residential area for the priests and elites, the latter was, as one can see, the habitation area for the common people such as merchants, agriculturalists, craftsmen, etc. All the skeletons, complete or fragmentary, came from the lower town and none from the citadel. For purposes of supervision of the excavation, the area in the lower town was subdivided and allotted to various officers. Thus we have names such as HR area after HR Hargreaves, VS area after MS Vats, and DK area after KN Dikshit. The skeletal remains were not found in a single area but were distributed all over the site. Vertically, the structures encountered at the site were assigned to early, intermediate and late periods. The locations of the skeletons and their stratigraphic horizons in brief were as follows. HR area, house 5, room 74, 14 skeletons. The excavator held that since 4 of the skeletons lay above the ruins of a wall of the late period, these should be assigned to a time posterior to abandonment of the settlement as a whole. So they were buried even when the civilization was existing. HR area house 3, incomplete remains of 3 skeletons from late period. HR area Dead Man's Lane, 1 fragmentary skeleton, stratigraphy debated, intermediate/late period. VS area, a lane between 2 houses, 6 skeletons. Stratigraphy debated, intermediate/late period. DK area, block 10A, 9 skeletons, many of them incomplete, fragments of crania and other bones, probably late period. DK area G section, well room tragedy, 2 skeletons, late period. It would be seen from the above that 1. The skeletons are scattered all over the site, and 2. They belong to different horizons, namely intermediate, late and even posterior to the abandonment of the site. What does the entire evidence show? If the massacre theory is to hold good, the implication would be that the invaders went from area to area to kill the inhabitants, since the skeletons are widely distributed in space. Well, one would have accepted this explanation, but what does one do with the hard fact that chronologically the skeletons belong to different periods, namely intermediate, late and are even posterior to the abandonment of the site? Had the skeletons been related to a massacre, they should have come from one and the same period, which would normally have been the latest. Yeah, because after the invasion has happened, the civilization can't go on, so it has to be the latest period. Since it has been claimed that after the massacre, the inhabitants were forced to leave this site and go to Tamil Nadu. Very clearly, therefore, the skeletons have nothing to do with any invasion or massacre. There are other questions which may be rightly asked. The victims of an invasion, at least some of them, should bear marks of injuries inflicted on them, either with javelin or sword or even arrows, but no such injury marks have been reported by any of the excavators. Were all of them Sanghis? The people who are excavating this, were the RSS people? Nor have any weapons of warfare been reported from any of the sites. Nor it would lead to an assumption that the invaders carried away with them all the weapons and the invaded were in all cases unarmed. This would appear to be a far-fetched assumption. All said, therefore, there is no case for sustaining the theory of a massacre, and George F. Dales, 1964, very rightly dubbed it as a mythical massacre. Further, if it had really been a case of mass massacre and extermination of the Harappans by the Aryan invaders, one would expect a few other sites too to have yielded some evidence of that sort. But the hard fact is that though hundreds of Harappan sites have been excavated by now, none has yielded any evidence even remotely suggestive of such a happening. Nor has any site yielded remains of an intrusive culture which may be associated with so-called invaders. Therefore, there is a continuity of occupation, though at some sites signs of deterioration may no doubt be seen. But that is a natural process that took place in a long-lived and exhausted material cultures the world over. Thus, whether Sir Mortimer would have liked it or not, Indra stands exonerated. A close associate of Wheeler, Professor Stuart Pigott, even attempted to draw a pen picture of the hypothetical Aryan invasion in the following words in 1952. Stuart Pigott writes, "In sum, however, the evidence from Balochistan and from Sindh and the Punjab is reasonably consistent in implying that at some period likely to have been before 1500 BC, to use a convenient round figure, the long-established cultural traditions of northwestern India were rudely and ruthlessly interrupted by the arrival of a new people from the west. The burning of Balochi villages and the equipment of the graves at Sahitump suggest that these new arrivals were predominantly conquerors who travelled light and adopted the pottery of the region in which they established themselves. In Sindh, at Chanhudaro, a barbarian settlement appears. Evidently the reference is to the Jhukar culture in the deserted ruins of the Harappan town, and here some local craftsmen may have remained to work for their alien masters, while the pottery suggests a resurgence of local non-Harappan elements." See, in every line they appropriate everywhere they go their own fucking guilt. Whether it's today's critical race theory being appropriated or extrapolated on Indian caste system, or whether it's their British colonization being extrapolated on Aryan invasion. They view the world what they do to others. At Mohenjo-daro, it seems clear that the civilization that had survived so long was already effete and on the wane when the raiders came, and at Harappa we know from the evidence of the rebuilding of the citadel walls that the inhabitants were on the defensive in the last days of the city, though these precautionary measures did not suffice to keep away the intruders, wherever they came from, who afterwards settled on the ruins and buried their dead in cemetery H for generations. The quote ends here. Now Bibilal writes, "There is a lot of make-believe in what Pigott has just stated. Thus, for example, no one seriously believes that the occurrence of ash, charcoal and red earth at a few sites in Balochistan or the graves at Shahitump are associated with any conquerors. As to the Jhukar culture at Chanhudaro, M.R. Mughal's excavations have conclusively proved that this culture was not at all alien, but just a transition from the Harappa culture itself. Similar is the case with the cemetery H culture at Harappa. Recent excavations by Meadow and Kenoyer have established 5 periods of occupation at the site, of which period 4, counting from the bottom, shows a transition towards the cemetery H culture, which is full bloom in period 5. Kenoyer writes in 1991, "Period 5 may reflect only a change in the focus of settlement organization from that which was the pattern of the earlier Harappan phase and not cultural discontinuity or urban decay, invading aliens or site abandonment, all of which have been suggested in the past. Nobody therefore should remain under the spell that cemetery H culture is alien and associable with so-called invading Aryans. On the other hand, there is a positive case for demonstrating the continuity of population in the Harappan region. This truth is revealed through a close study of the human skeletal remains from a large number of protohistoric sites by Hemphill and his colleagues, who emphatically state in 1991, as for the question of biological continuity with the Indus Valley, 2 discontinuities appear to exist. The first occurs between 6500 to 4500 BC. The second occurs at some point after 800 BC, but before 200 BC. So even biologically, Bibilal writes, there is no case for an alien invasion or immigration, much less of the Aryans. In the context of this Aryan invasion debate, it may also be well worthwhile to quote the views of some distinguished Western archaeologists. Thus, a renowned archaeologist from the country of Wheeler and Pigott themselves, Colin Renfrew, wrote in 1988 that when Wheeler speaks of the Aryan invasion of the land of the 7 rivers, the Punjab, he has no warranty at all, so far as I can see. If one checks the dozen references in Rigveda to the 7 rivers, there is nothing in any of them that to me implies an invasion. Despite Wheeler's comments, it is difficult to see what is particularly non-Aryan about the Indus Valley. Wheeler's post ends here. Bibilal writes, "From across the Atlantic comes another descent. Two eminent archaeologists from USA, namely Jim G. Schaefer and Diane Lichtenstein in 1999, totally disagree with the invasion theory. They write, a few scholars have proposed that there is nothing in the literature firmly placing the Indo-Aryans outside of South Asia, and now archaeological records is confirming this. As data accumulate to support cultural continuity in South Asian prehistoric and historic periods, a considerable restructuring of existing interpretive paradigms must take place. We reject most strongly the simplistic historical interpretations which date back to the 18th century that continue to be imposed on South Asian cultural history. These still prevailing interpretations are significantly diminished by European ethnocentrism, colonialism, racism, and anti-Semitism." Their post ends here. And Bibilal ends the chapter by saying, "With the foregoing detailed analysis, should we not treat the Aryan invasion chapter as closed?" This is where the chapter 2 ends.